It did not end the way people expected. There was no sudden silence across the planet, no single moment where the lights went out everywhere at once, no dramatic announcement that civilization had reached its final day. Instead, it began like most endings in human history, quietly, unevenly, almost politely, as if the world itself was trying not to alarm the people living inside it. On that day, the Earth still rotated with the same patience it had shown for billions of years. Oceans still moved under the pull of the moon. Cities still breathed with traffic, electricity, communication, and routine. People still woke up thinking in terms of schedules, obligations, and small personal concerns, unaware that the idea of normal was already beginning to loosen its grip on reality. In the largest cities, mornings began like any other. Subways filled with tired faces. Coffee shops opened their shutters. Screens lit up with news that felt important at the time but would soon become distant noise in memory. Children went to schools where lessons continued, as if the future was something guaranteed rather than something being negotiated in real time by forces too large to notice. And yet beneath all of it, something had already shifted. It started in systems too large for any single person to feel directly. Supply chains showed delays that were still explainable. Weather patterns drifted slightly outside their expected ranges but remained within acceptable limits. Communication networks experienced small disruptions that engineers corrected quickly. Nothing appeared catastrophic. Nothing demanded panic. But civilization is not held together by dramatic moments. It is held together by repetition, by reliability, by the quiet assumption that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough that planning remains meaningful. And on that day, that assumption began to weaken. In government centers, reports arrived from multiple regions describing inconsistencies in infrastructure performance. Energy distribution remained functional, but demand curves no longer matched predictions with the same precision. Transportation systems still operated, but scheduling required increasingly frequent adjustment. Economic models began to show instability not as collapse, but as drift. At first, analysts described it as noise in the data. Noise is a comforting word. It suggests randomness, something temporary, something that can be filtered out. But the patterns persisted. They repeated across different systems that were not supposed to influence each other. That is when the language of noise slowly began to change into something less comfortable, though still carefully phrased. Anomalies, deviations, unstable correlations. None of these words suggested failure. They suggested observation, control, distance from the problem. Meanwhile, on the surface of everyday life, people continued their routines. A man left his apartment late for work, checking his phone as he walked through a crowded street where thousands of other people were doing the same thing. A woman stood on a train platform watching the arrival board flicker slightly longer than usual before correcting itself. A child asked a question in a classroom that was answered correctly, but with a brief hesitation from the teacher that no one else noticed. Civilization was still functioning. That was the most important fact. Everything else was interpretation. But interpretation is how humans eventually recognize change. By midday, satellite systems began reporting atmospheric inconsistencies across multiple continents. Not storms, not disasters, but mismatches between predictive climate models and observed behavior. Air currents were shifting in ways that did not align with established global circulation patterns. Again, the deviations were small. Again, they were explainable individually. But together, they formed something that no longer felt like coincidence. In scientific institutions, meetings were called not in emergency tone but in analytical tone. Data was shared. Charts were examined. Hypotheses were adjusted. The language remained controlled, almost calm, because science is trained to resist emotional interpretation until evidence becomes undeniable. Still, something in the room felt heavier than usual. It is difficult to describe the moment when experts begin to feel uncertainty without yet admitting it. It is not panic. It is not confusion. It is a subtle loss of confidence in the assumption that the system under study is fully understood. Outside those rooms, the world kept moving. Trains arrived and departed. Power grids balanced supply and demand. Financial markets opened and closed with familiar fluctuations. People argued about personal matters, planned dinners, worried about money, thought about the future in ordinary terms. But the future was no longer behaving like a straight continuation of the present. It was beginning to bend in small, almost invisible ways. By evening, certain regions experienced minor communication delays that could not be fully traced to hardware failure. Emergency systems activated redundancies that were not strictly necessary, but were triggered by threshold-based safeguards. News organizations reported technical disruptions in some areas, while emphasizing that no major outages had occurred. The reassurance was technically accurate, and also incomplete, because accuracy and truth are not always the same thing in systems that are beginning to lose coherence. As night approached in some parts of the world, the first truly noticeable change occurred not in infrastructure, but in perception. People began reporting a strange feeling that time was not flowing uniformly. Not time itself, clocks still measured it perfectly, but the experience of it. Some hours felt compressed, others felt unusually extended. Events that should have felt immediate seemed slightly detached, as if occurring a fraction of a second further away from awareness than usual. Psychologists would later debate whether this was collective stress or the early sign of deeper systemic disruption. At the time, it was simply noted and archived. On the surface, cities still glowed with light, airports still operated, hospitals still functioned, emergency services were still ready, still responsive, still capable. If someone had looked at Earth from a distance that night, it would have still appeared alive in every conventional sense. But civilization is not measured only by what continues to work. It is measured by how long things continue to work without needing adjustment. And on that first day, the number of adjustments required quietly increased. In the final hours before what would later be called the beginning of the last phase, there was no global announcement, no unified recognition, no moment of collective understanding. Instead, there were millions of individual experiences of slightly different instability, scattered across a planet that had not yet agreed with itself that something fundamental was changing. A commuter noticed a delay. A technician noticed a mismatch in system readings. A pilot noticed an unusual pattern in atmospheric data. A scientist noticed a divergence in simulation outputs. None of them alone represented the end, but together they formed the first page of it. And as the Earth turned through that night, carrying cities full of people who still believed in continuity, the systems that held civilization together continued to function, just a little less predictably than before. Not broken, not gone, just beginning to loosen. And in that loosening, the last day of human civilization quietly began, without anyone yet having the words to call it that. It did not become clearer overnight. In fact, the second phase made everything more confusing because nothing fully failed. Civilization does not usually end with systems turning off. It ends with systems continuing to operate just long enough to make people doubt their own interpretation of what failure even looks like. By morning in some regions and deep night in others, the world still functioned. Electricity still flowed through grids. Internet systems still carried information. Governments still issued statements meant to reduce uncertainty. Markets still opened, though with slightly more hesitation than before. Hospitals still treated patients. Airports still scheduled flights, even if some routes required recalculation. And because everything was still working, most people continued to believe that whatever was happening was temporary. That belief is powerful. It delays recognition. It keeps societies stable longer than they logically should remain stable. But underneath that surface continuity, the drift had not stopped. It had only become more distributed. In climate monitoring centers, global datasets were now showing inconsistencies that no longer aligned neatly with previous models. It was not just one system behaving unpredictably. It was multiple systems producing results that subtly disagreed with each other while still remaining internally consistent. That distinction confused analysts more than outright failure would have. A broken system is easier to understand than a system that partially agrees with itself, but not with other systems. Ocean temperature readings no longer matched atmospheric heat exchange predictions. Satellite imaging of cloud formation showed patterns that did not fully correspond with ground-based sensor data. Even seismic monitoring in stable regions began to show minor irregularities that could not be linked to known geological causes. Each dataset on its own was acceptable. Together, they formed something that did not behave like a single planet anymore. In scientific language, there was still reluctance to use words that implied total systemic instability. Instead, phrases like cross-domain inconsistency and multi-layer desynchronization began appearing in internal reports. Language was still trying to protect meaning from collapse, but meaning was already beginning to stretch. In cities, people noticed smaller changes first. Water pressure fluctuated slightly in buildings where it had always been stable. Traffic systems that had been perfectly synchronized required minor manual overrides. Digital assistants occasionally repeated confirmations or delayed responses by fractions of a second longer than expected. None of these things were dangerous, but they were noticeable. And once something becomes noticeable, it starts to accumulate attention. Attention is the first stage of societal change. By midday, emergency coordination centers across multiple countries were now exchanging reports more frequently, not because of disasters, but because of inconsistencies in prediction models. Forecasting systems, which had previously agreed with each other across agencies and regions, were now diverging. One model would predict stability, another would predict slight disruption, a third would predict no significant change at all. All three could still justify their outputs individually, but they could not agree on reality. In transportation systems, flight routes were being adjusted more frequently, not due to weather emergencies, but due to uncertainty margins expanding beyond normal operational comfort levels. Airlines began rerouting conservatively, adding buffer times to schedules that had previously been optimized for precision. Passengers experienced delays, but no one could point to a single cause. And that made frustration feel strangely directionless. In financial systems, volatility increased slightly, but not enough to signal crisis. Instead, markets reacted to uncertainty itself. Investors responded not to events, but to the unpredictability of events. This created a loop. The less predictable the system became, the more cautious behavior increased, which in turn amplified irregularity in system flow. Still, nothing collapsed. That was the most unsettling part. Collapse would have been understandable. Instead, there was only drift. In the afternoon, scientific agencies began sharing consolidated reports for the first time across international boundaries. The language was careful, but the conclusion emerging between lines of data was increasingly difficult to avoid. There was no single point of failure. There was no isolated breakdown. There was a gradual loss of synchronization across systems that were never meant to operate independently from one another. Earth as a system was no longer fully aligning with itself. In simpler terms that were not yet officially used, the planet was still working, but not together. At ground level, people continued their lives. A teacher finished a lesson and dismissed students early because the school announced precautionary adjustments to scheduling. A factory reduced production slightly due to supply timing uncertainty. A family discussed dinner plans while noticing that delivery services were taking longer than usual. Life did not stop. It only required more explanation than before. An explanation is where stability begins to weaken. By evening, a coordinated briefing was held between multiple scientific agencies. The tone remained formal, but there was a shared recognition forming quietly in the background of every statement. The models were no longer converging toward a single reliable projection of near-term global behavior. Not because data was missing, but because data was no longer agreeing with itself across systems. That is a subtle but critical shift. It means prediction is still possible, but consistency is not. Outside the briefing rooms, the sky remained ordinary. Streets were still lit. Weather was still within survivable ranges. Nothing visible indicated that civilization was entering a final phase. And yet, inside those rooms, something had already changed permanently. The assumption that tomorrow would resemble today was no longer fully supported by global data. It had not been disproven. It had simply stopped being guaranteed. And in the history of civilizations, that is often the point where endings begin without announcing themselves. By the third phase, the world had not become unrecognizable in appearance, but it had become increasingly unreliable in behavior. That distinction mattered more than anyone initially understood. Cities still stood in their familiar shapes. Roads still connected places in ways that made sense on maps. Oceans still bordered continents. Mountains still held their positions with geological patience. From a purely visual perspective, Earth remained intact. But systems no longer behaved with consistent coordination across distance. What had begun as small discrepancies between models was now showing up as measurable differences in how infrastructure responded across regions that were supposed to be synchronized. Power grids in separate continents began experiencing minor phase mismatches in load balancing systems that had previously operated with near-perfect alignment. Communication networks still functioned, but latency patterns began to vary in ways that could not be fully explained by technical limitations alone. The most unsettling part was that these changes were not failures in isolation. They were consistent inconsistencies, patterns of mismatch that appeared across unrelated systems. In global monitoring centers, analysts no longer spoke in terms of single causes. Instead, they began describing systemic divergence, a phrase that sounded controlled but carried an uncomfortable implication. The systems were still working, but no longer agreeing on the same version of reality. Weather prediction was one of the first domains where this became impossible to ignore. Forecast models that had once converged reliably now began to split early in their projections. A single atmospheric condition input could produce multiple plausible outcomes that no longer reconciled over time. It was not randomness. It was structured divergence, models following internally consistent logic while drifting apart from each other. Meteorologists began issuing forecasts with broader confidence ranges, not because of lack of data, but because certainty itself was degrading. On the surface, people experienced this as inconvenience. A rainstorm arriving earlier or later than expected, temperatures shifting slightly outside predicted ranges, wind patterns behaving inconsistently across nearby regions. None of it was immediately catastrophic. But predictability is not just about survival. It is about trust in systems that extend beyond human perception. And that trust was weakening. In transportation systems, scheduling algorithms began requiring frequent recalibration. Train networks in some regions experienced minor timing desynchronization, not enough to cause accidents, but enough to disrupt the sense of reliability that had defined modern infrastructure for decades. Air travel remained operational, but flight path optimization systems began introducing conservative buffers not based on weather risk, but on systemic uncertainty. This was new. Risk was no longer tied only to environmental conditions, it was tied to unpredictability itself. Even digital systems, which had once been considered the most stable layer of civilization, began showing subtle inconsistencies. Cloud services experienced irregular load distribution patterns that could not be traced to user demand alone. Data synchronization across servers occasionally required additional verification steps that had not been necessary before. Engineers referred to it as state drift, a quiet term for something that felt more like reality itself, was no longer maintaining a unified state across distance. In scientific institutions, the language of explanation was evolving faster than the systems it described. Reports began emphasizing that no single subsystem could be identified as the origin point of instability. Instead, the issue appeared to exist in the relationships between systems. This was a critical shift. It meant the problem was not located inside any one structure. It was in the coordination between all structures. In practical terms, this made resolution far more difficult. You cannot repair something that fails only in combination, not in isolation. Meanwhile, daily human life continued with a growing sense of soft adjustment. People began checking information more frequently before making decisions. Travel plans were made with more flexibility. Work schedules included more contingency time. Conversations increasingly included phrases like "just in case" and "depending on conditions." These small linguistic changes reflected a deeper psychological adaptation. Expectation was becoming conditional. In earlier stages of civilization, expectation was linear. People assumed continuity unless interrupted. Now, expectation itself had begun to branch. In educational systems, students were still learning as normal, but even curricula began subtly shifting emphasis toward adaptability rather than fixed prediction. The idea that systems could behave unpredictably at large scales was becoming part of general understanding, even if the full implication was not yet emotionally processed. In households, the changes were quieter. Appliances still worked, utilities still functioned, but small irregularities became part of daily awareness. A delay in service response, a slight mismatch in delivery timing, a brief inconsistency in automated systems that corrected themselves before requiring intervention. Each instance was minor, but together they created a new baseline. Life required more attention than before. By evening, international coordination centers began discussing the possibility that global systems were entering a state of non-unified synchronization. The phrase was intentionally cautious. It avoided words like breakdown or collapse, but the meaning behind it was clear to those who understood system theory. The world was no longer behaving as a single synchronized structure. It was behaving as multiple stable structures that no longer fully aligned with each other. This realization did not produce immediate panic. Instead, it produced something quieter and more dangerous: recalibration. Institutions began adjusting their expectations downward, not because systems had failed, but because they could no longer rely on unified behavior across all regions. In other words, civilization was still functioning, but no longer on a shared global rhythm. And without a shared rhythm, coordination becomes progressively harder to maintain at scale. Still, from the outside, Earth appeared normal. Light still illuminated cities. Weather still cycled through familiar patterns locally. People still lived, worked, and moved through their lives with continuity. But beneath that continuity, the structure that once ensured global coherence was continuing to loosen. Not breaking, not stopping, just no longer fully agreeing with itself. By the fifth phase, humanity had begun to understand that the problem was no longer temporary. That realization did not arrive through a single announcement or undeniable catastrophe. It arrived through exhaustion, through the slow accumulation of adjustments that never stopped increasing, through the growing awareness that every system now required constant correction just to maintain what used to happen naturally. Civilization was still functioning, but it had stopped flowing effortlessly. In earlier centuries, the greatest infrastructures on Earth had been designed around a simple assumption: stability. Engineers expected rivers to behave within predictable ranges. Power systems were built on expected demand curves. Communication networks relied on timing precision that assumed synchronized planetary conditions. Now all of those assumptions were becoming conditional. Not false, just unreliable. In global energy systems, balancing became increasingly difficult. Demand fluctuated unpredictably across regions for reasons that could not always be explained by weather, economics, or human behavior. Grid operators began relying heavily on adaptive AI systems that could respond in real time to changing conditions. At first, these systems performed remarkably well. But even artificial intelligence struggled when the environment itself stopped behaving consistently. The algorithms were designed to optimize within stable frameworks. What they encountered instead was continuous low-level divergence across multiple layers of reality. Atmospheric instability affecting energy transfer, communication delays affecting coordination, population behavior shifting in response to uncertainty itself. The systems could adapt, but adaptation was consuming more and more of civilization's resources. This was the first moment some analysts privately began using a phrase that had once belonged only to theoretical discussions: maintenance civilization. A society no longer expanding confidently into the future, but dedicating most of its efforts simply to preserving continuity in the present. That shift changed everything. In cities, people noticed how much of daily life had become about compensation. Transportation systems still worked, but with growing delays built into schedules. Digital services still functioned, but verification layers increased. Supply chains still delivered necessities, but redundancy planning became part of ordinary logistics. Nothing was gone. Everything just required more effort. And effort scales poorly across entire civilizations. In hospitals, the effects were subtle but deeply revealing. Medical systems remained operational, yet administrative coordination became increasingly complex. Data synchronization across networks occasionally required manual confirmation. Emergency routing systems recalculated more frequently than before. Staffing patterns shifted unpredictably as transportation reliability weakened. Doctors still treated patients successfully, but the invisible structure supporting modern medicine had become less stable than the medicine itself. Education changed too. Schools and universities began teaching adaptability as a foundational skill, not as a specialty. Students learned how to operate within uncertain systems rather than assuming stable frameworks. Forecasting was taught alongside contingency planning. Even language shifted toward probability instead of certainty. The future was no longer described as something approaching. It was described as something conditional. This psychological transition spread quietly through society. People still made plans, but they held those plans differently in their minds. Vacations became tentative. Career paths became flexible. Long-term projects included escape conditions and alternate scenarios. Hope still existed, but confidence had weakened. In scientific communities, the data continued to resist simplification. Every attempt to isolate a primary cause led back to the same disturbing conclusion. No single system was failing independently. The instability existed between systems. Earth's atmosphere still functioned. Its oceans still circulated. Its infrastructure still operated. Human cognition still worked. But the synchronization between these layers was degrading. It was as if the planet had lost some invisible coordinating rhythm that previously held complexity together. And because civilization itself depended on synchronization across enormous scales, it began inheriting that instability. One evening, in a monitoring facility buried beneath a mountain range designed to survive nearly any environmental catastrophe, a systems analyst noticed something small but impossible to ignore. Multiple independent forecasting systems, developed in different countries, using different architectures and separate data sources, had begun producing the same unusual pattern. Not the same prediction. The same uncertainty structure. Each model diverged differently, but all of them showed a common feature. Beyond a certain point in projection time, reality stopped converging toward stable outcomes. The future itself had become mathematically less coherent. The analyst stared at the graphs for a long time before sending the report upward through channels that were already overloaded with similar observations from other disciplines. Climate science, infrastructure modeling, economic forecasting, ecological systems, communication theory. All were beginning to encounter the same invisible wall. A horizon beyond which prediction no longer stabilized. This did not mean the world was ending immediately. It meant continuity could no longer be assumed. That distinction mattered enormously. Civilizations can survive disasters. What they struggle to survive is persistent unpredictability. Because unpredictability erodes coordination, and coordination is the true foundation of large-scale human systems. Outside the mountain facility, night settled across cities that still glowed with artificial light. Restaurants still served meals. Families still gathered in homes. Music still played in apartments overlooking crowded streets. Life continued with remarkable stubbornness. That is one of the defining characteristics of humanity, the ability to normalize instability for astonishing lengths of time. And yet beneath the routines, people were changing. Not dramatically. Gradually. They checked systems more often. They trusted forecasts less completely. They built redundancy into ordinary decisions. They learned to expect correction rather than smooth continuity. Children growing up during this phase adapted fastest. To them, instability did not feel like collapse because they had never fully experienced uninterrupted global coherence. They learned flexibility the way earlier generations learned certainty. But older generations felt the difference constantly. They remembered when systems worked quietly in the background, without demanding attention. Now everything demanded attention. And attention, spread across billions of people and millions of systems, became civilization's most exhausted resource. Still, Earth continued turning beneath the stars. Still, oceans reflected moonlight. Still, humanity persisted inside a world that had not broken apart, but had begun losing the invisible coordination that once made complexity feel effortless. And in that slow loss of effortless order, the last day of civilization moved forward quietly, hour by hour, without needing catastrophe to announce itself. By the sixth phase, people had stopped asking when things would return to normal. That question had quietly disappeared from conversation, replaced by a different kind of thinking entirely. Instead of asking whether instability would end, governments, institutions, and ordinary individuals began asking how long stability could still be maintained locally. This was a profound psychological shift. Civilization had crossed an invisible boundary. The future was no longer imagined as recovery, but as management. Not survival in the dramatic sense. Management in the exhausting sense. Managing uncertainty. Managing synchronization failures. Managing systems that still functioned individually, but no longer aligned smoothly with one another. Across the planet, the rhythm of human life slowed slightly under the weight of continuous adjustment. Air travel still existed, but routes were increasingly conservative. Cargo systems still moved resources globally, but redundancies consumed growing amounts of energy and labor. Digital communication still connected billions of people instantly, but authentication layers and verification protocols expanded constantly to compensate for drifting inconsistencies between networks. Every system was becoming more defensive. In earlier eras, civilization expanded outward confidently, assuming the environment beneath it was stable enough to support increasing complexity. Now complexity itself was becoming difficult to maintain, because complexity depends on trust between systems. And trust was weakening everywhere. In major cities, subtle changes accumulated into a new atmosphere of daily life. Not fear, not panic, something quieter. Fatigue. People were tired in a way that sleep did not fully solve. Not physical exhaustion alone, though that existed too. It was cognitive fatigue from living inside systems that required constant awareness. Simple tasks now involved more checking, more confirming, more contingency planning. A commuter leaving for work checked transit updates repeatedly before departing. A hospital administrator reviewed supply inventories more frequently than previous protocols required. Parents monitored school notifications with unusual attention because schedules often shifted unexpectedly. No single adjustment was overwhelming. But civilization is built from billions of repeated assumptions. And now those assumptions required maintenance. Psychologists began documenting rising levels of what they called ambient uncertainty stress. Unlike acute fear, which spikes sharply around visible danger, ambient stress remained low but constant, stretching across entire populations without clear moments of release. Humans had evolved to survive immediate threats. They were less prepared for endless subtle instability. In underground research facilities and orbital stations, scientists continued searching for a unified explanation. But the deeper the investigation went, the stranger the problem became. Earth systems were not collapsing symmetrically. Some regions stabilized temporarily, while others drifted further. Certain atmospheric patterns returned to near-normal behavior for short periods before diverging again unpredictably. Oceanic systems showed partial recovery in some sectors while failing elsewhere. The planet was behaving less like a single organism, and more like loosely connected processes struggling to maintain coherence. One climate researcher described it privately as partial reality agreement. The phrase spread quietly because it captured the feeling too accurately. The systems were still real, still measurable, still functioning, but no longer fully synchronized with one another across scale and distance. Even time-sensitive coordination between continents became more difficult. International conferences increasingly relied on adaptive scheduling systems because communication timing inconsistencies, though tiny individually, accumulated enough to disrupt high-precision synchronization. Milliseconds became meaningful. That frightened engineers more than major outages would have, because it suggested the instability existed at foundational levels of coordination itself. Meanwhile, ordinary people adapted in practical ways. Homes began storing more supplies, not out of panic buying, but from learned caution. Businesses shortened long-term forecasting windows. Construction projects included modular fallback systems. Families developed informal local support networks because centralized systems no longer felt completely dependable. Humanity was becoming more localized emotionally, even while remaining globally connected technologically. That contradiction defined the era perfectly. People could still communicate instantly across the world, but they trusted nearby stability more than distant coordination. In educational systems, children practiced contingency scenarios as routinely as earlier generations practiced emergency drills. Adaptability became more valuable than prediction. Teachers focused less on fixed pathways and more on dynamic problem-solving within unstable environments. A generation was growing up without deep memory of uninterrupted global reliability. And because of that, they adapted faster psychologically than adults who remembered the old rhythm of civilization. Older people struggled most with the transition, not because they lacked resilience, but because they could feel what had been lost. They remembered when systems disappeared into the background of life instead of demanding constant attention. They remembered when trust in infrastructure was automatic, when predictions converged naturally, when stability felt invisible because it was everywhere. Now stability felt expensive and increasingly temporary. One evening, in a coastal city that had once symbolized technological progress, the electrical grid experienced a brief synchronization anomaly. Lights flickered for less than 4 seconds. Backup systems activated instantly. No damage occurred. But millions of people paused simultaneously. Not because of the flicker itself, because everyone immediately understood that even tiny disruptions now carried emotional weight far beyond their practical impact. That was the real transformation. Civilization had entered a state where confidence no longer recovered automatically after instability. Each irregularity lingered psychologically. Each adjustment accumulated. Each correction reminded people that the systems beneath their lives were working harder than before just to remain functional. Still, the world remained astonishingly operational. Restaurants still filled with conversation. Trains still crossed continents. Satellites still circled overhead carrying signals between billions of devices. Music still played through headphones on crowded streets, where strangers moved past one another beneath glowing advertisements. Humanity had not stopped living. It had simply begun living inside increasing uncertainty, without fully admitting how permanent that uncertainty might become. Late that night, inside one of the largest global systems coordination centers ever constructed, analysts reviewed a set of projections that none of them wanted to summarize aloud. The models showed that stabilization efforts were still working locally. But globally, the amount of intervention required to maintain coherence was rising faster than civilization's capacity to sustain it indefinitely. In simpler terms, the world was still holding together, but it was no longer holding together naturally. And somewhere beneath the endless movement of traffic, information, electricity, weather, and human thought, the final day of civilization continued unfolding, not through collapse, but through the slow exhaustion of the systems required to prevent collapse from arriving. By the 7th phase, humanity had entered a condition that earlier civilizations would not have recognized as decline, because almost everything still existed. Governments still governed. Economies still functioned. Cities still expanded in some regions. The internet still connected billions of minds in real time. From the outside, civilization remained astonishingly alive. And yet internally, something fundamental had changed. The world no longer trusted itself. That mistrust did not appear emotionally at first. It emerged mathematically. Forecasting systems across nearly every major discipline were beginning to fail in the same specific way. They could still model the present with extraordinary accuracy, but their ability to project stable futures beyond short time windows was deteriorating rapidly. This was not because technology had weakened. It was because reality itself had become less cooperative with prediction. Weather systems shifted outside expected probabilities too frequently. Human behavioral patterns changed in response to instability faster than economic models could absorb. Supply chains rerouted so often that optimization systems began prioritizing resilience over efficiency automatically. Civilization was adapting, but adaptation had become its primary activity. In earlier eras, adaptation happened around the edges of life. Now it was becoming life itself. Entire industries reorganized around uncertainty management. Insurance systems transformed from statistical prediction models into dynamic risk balancing networks that updated continuously. Infrastructure planners abandoned assumptions of long-term stability and instead designed systems that could survive constant recalibration. Nothing was built to remain unchanged anymore. Everything was built to bend. And bending, over long enough periods, changes the shape of civilizations permanently. In homes across the world, routines became softer, less rigid. Families left larger gaps between commitments because schedules had become unreliable. People traveled less far and less necessary. Digital systems increasingly warned users about conditional reliability windows, a phrase that would have sounded absurd only a decade earlier. Children adapted almost immediately. To them, flexibility felt normal. Adults carried the psychological strain differently. They remembered the invisible confidence that once existed beneath ordinary life, the sense that systems could be trusted to continue operating tomorrow exactly as they had yesterday. Now every successful day felt slightly provisional. This produced an emotional atmosphere unlike panic or fear. It was anticipatory fatigue, the sense that something else would soon require adjustment again. And usually something did. One afternoon, a coordinated network of weather satellites began reporting atmospheric flow behaviors that directly contradicted one another. In earlier years, such contradictions would have implied sensor malfunction, but diagnostics confirmed the instruments were working correctly. The atmosphere itself was behaving inconsistently across scales. Localized patterns remained stable. Global integration did not. That distinction terrified climate scientists more than dramatic disasters ever had, because it suggested Earth systems were no longer operating as a fully unified structure. Instead, they behaved like partially independent regions struggling to synchronize. The planet still existed, but its coherence was weakening. In response, governments intensified stabilization measures. Massive computational systems monitored energy flow, transportation timing, agricultural output, communication stability, and environmental behavior simultaneously. Artificial intelligence coordinated interventions faster than any human organization could manage alone. For a while, this worked remarkably well. Human civilization became an active maintenance process rather than a passive continuation of stable systems. But maintenance has limits. Every correction required energy. Every adaptation consumed resources. Every redundancy reduced efficiency. Civilization was beginning to spend more effort preserving itself than advancing itself. That imbalance mattered. Because growth civilizations and maintenance civilizations behave differently psychologically. Growth creates optimism. Maintenance creates caution. And caution, spread across billions of people, changes the emotional structure of the world. Entertainment shifted first. Popular media became quieter, more nostalgic, more focused on stability, memory, and familiar routines. People consumed stories about ordinary life with unusual emotional intensity because ordinary life itself had begun to feel fragile. Music slowed. Architecture prioritized comfort over ambition. Public spaces were redesigned to reduce psychological stress rather than maximize activity. Humanity was unconsciously trying to recreate emotional continuity inside a world that no longer provided structural continuity automatically. Meanwhile, scientific institutions continued searching desperately for a central explanation that still refused to appear. No hidden object in space. No singular atmospheric toxin. No catastrophic geological trigger. Instead, there was only the same impossible pattern repeating across every layer of analysis. Relationships between systems were weakening. The systems themselves still functioned, but their ability to coordinate naturally was degrading. One systems theorist described it in a classified briefing, using language so simple it unsettled everyone in the room. "The world still works," he said quietly, "but it no longer works together." No one argued with him, because by then, everyone had already felt it. Late that evening, a temporary synchronization failure affected global positioning systems for less than 30 seconds. Backup corrections activated immediately. Transportation networks remained operational. No crashes occurred. No infrastructure collapsed. Objectively, the event was minor. Emotionally, it was enormous. Because civilization depends less on perfection than on confidence. And confidence was becoming difficult to restore fully after each disruption. People no longer reacted to incidents individually. They reacted cumulatively. Every flicker, every delay, every anomaly carried the weight of all previous anomalies before it. This accumulation changed public behavior slowly but permanently. Large gatherings became less common in some regions. Migration towards smaller, more self-sufficient communities increased slightly year by year. Local trust networks grew stronger while institutional trust became more conditional. Not hostile, just cautious. Still, the planet remained alive with movement. Ships crossed oceans. Data traveled through fiber-optic cables beneath continents. Hospitals saved lives. Teachers taught students. Couples fell in love. Children laughed in parks beneath skies that still looked mostly normal. Humanity continued forward with extraordinary determination. But beneath that determination was a growing awareness that civilization was no longer moving smoothly through time. It was balancing itself moment by moment against a world that had stopped guaranteeing continuity. And as midnight approached in different time zones across Earth, the systems that held humanity together continued functioning through sheer effort, adaptation, and endless correction. While somewhere deep beneath the surface of daily life, the final day of civilization moved quietly onward, not with violence but with increasing strain. By the 8th phase, the world had begun shrinking emotionally long before it shrank physically. People still had access to global communication. Satellites still linked continents instantly. Aircraft still crossed oceans. Cargo still moved through ports glowing with artificial light late into the night. But psychologically, humanity had started pulling inward. Not out of fear alone. Out of exhaustion. Large-scale civilization depends on invisible confidence between strangers. A person boards a train believing the tracks were inspected correctly. A hospital trusts medicine arriving from thousands of kilometers away. Entire economies function because billions of people assume systems beyond their understanding will continue operating tomorrow. Now that assumption had weakened enough that trust itself required maintenance. And maintaining trust across billions of minds is one of the hardest tasks any civilization can attempt. Governments noticed the shift first in subtle patterns of behavior. Long-distance travel declined gradually despite transportation systems remaining operational. People preferred staying closer to regions they understood personally. Local communities became more emotionally significant than national identity in many places. Not because nations disappeared, because immediacy felt safer than scale. Economic systems adapted accordingly. Regional production networks expanded to reduce dependence on unstable global timing systems. Cities invested heavily in localized energy, food, and manufacturing infrastructures. The goal was not independence in the old political sense. It was continuity. If the larger system drifted further, smaller systems needed to survive locally. This strategy worked surprisingly well for a time. Human civilization became more modular, more compartmentalized, more capable of surviving partial instability without immediate collapse. But compartmentalization carries a hidden cost. It reduces synchronization even further. The more humanity localized itself emotionally and economically, the harder it became to maintain unified global coordination. And global coordination was exactly what the planet's growing instability demanded most. In scientific communities, the atmosphere had changed completely by now. Earlier caution had been replaced with a kind of disciplined realism. Researchers no longer asked whether the systems were drifting. They focused instead on how quickly divergence was spreading between domains. Oceanic models, atmospheric systems, human behavioral forecasting, infrastructure timing networks, ecological recovery patterns, all showed the same fundamental structure: localized stability surrounded by weakening large-scale coherence. Earth was no longer behaving like one integrated environment. It was behaving like partially connected regions, negotiating temporary agreements with each other. One late-night briefing inside a multinational coordination center summarized the problem with brutal simplicity. Synchronization is now resource-dependent. The sentence changed the room instantly. Because for most of human history, synchronization had been natural. Day and night synchronized biological rhythms. Climate synchronized agriculture. Stable physics synchronized infrastructure. Civilization grew on top of that invisible harmony without needing to sustain it consciously. Now harmony itself required effort. And effort has limits. Outside the coordination centers, ordinary life continued in ways that felt strangely beautiful because of their fragility. Restaurants still filled with conversation. Street musicians still played beneath glowing signs. Children still learned mathematics in classrooms, while rain tapped softly against windows. People still argued, laughed, worried about relationships, dreamed about careers. Human life is remarkably persistent that way. Even during decline, most moments remain ordinary. Especially during decline. But ordinary life had become increasingly dependent on constant correction, happening invisibly behind the scenes. Massive AI stabilization systems now adjusted infrastructure in real time continuously. Electrical grids compensated for unpredictable demand fluctuations. Communication systems rerouted data around synchronization inconsistencies. Agricultural networks dynamically shifted supply chains hour by hour. The world was still functioning because enormous technological systems were actively preventing instability from cascading into failure. Humanity had essentially become the caretaker of its own continuity. But the caretaking process was consuming more and more of civilization's total capacity. This imbalance began appearing culturally too. Fewer people spoke confidently about distant futures. Megaprojects designed to span generations were postponed or redesigned into smaller modular phases. Architecture emphasized resilience over permanence. Even entertainment became increasingly centered around memory, familiarity, and emotional grounding. Society was unconsciously preparing itself for instability to continue indefinitely. One evening, in a residential district of a city that had once represented the height of technological modernity, a brief communication desynchronization affected local networks. Messages arrived out of order for approximately 40 seconds. The issue corrected automatically almost immediately. No real harm occurred. But afterward, people described the experience in strangely emotional terms. It felt wrong. Not dangerous. Not catastrophic. Wrong. Because humans rely on continuity emotionally even more than practically. Small fractures in synchronization disturb something ancient inside the mind, the expectation that reality unfolds in shared sequence. And shared sequence was becoming harder to maintain globally. By midnight in many regions, environmental systems were again showing irregular coupling behaviors. Wind currents failed to align cleanly with thermal distributions. Ocean monitoring stations reported localized stabilization occurring simultaneously with broader pattern fragmentation. The planet continued operating, but no longer elegantly. One exhausted systems engineer described Earth during this phase as a machine held together by active negotiation. The phrase spread quietly through scientific circles because it captured the reality perfectly. Nothing had fully failed. Nothing had fully recovered either. Instead, civilization existed inside continuous mediation between systems that no longer aligned naturally. Late that night, while billions of people slept beneath illuminated skylines and humming infrastructure, a small group of analysts reviewed long-range projections generated by the most advanced predictive systems humanity had ever created. The models still showed survival pathways, but none of them showed effortless continuity anymore. Every future now depended on intervention, correction, adaptation, maintenance. The age of automatic stability was over. And although humanity had not yet emotionally accepted what that meant, the last day of civilization continued unfolding quietly across the earth, not through sudden destruction, but through the gradual realization that the world no longer sustained itself without constant human effort holding it together. By the ninth phase, humanity had begun losing something more important than infrastructure. It had begun losing certainty in continuity itself. Not hope. Hope still existed everywhere. People still planned birthdays, studied for careers, repaired homes, planted gardens in controlled environments, fell asleep beside people they loved, and woke each morning expecting life to continue. But beneath those ordinary acts was a growing awareness that continuity no longer felt automatic. It felt negotiated. This distinction changed civilization psychologically more than any visible disaster could have. Because human beings can survive fear surprisingly well. What slowly exhausts them is sustained uncertainty. Across the world, governments continued functioning with increasing sophistication. Emergency coordination systems had become astonishingly advanced. Artificial intelligence balanced energy systems dynamically. Predictive logistics rerouted supplies before disruptions became visible. Medical networks adapted continuously to fluctuating regional conditions. Technologically, civilization had never been more capable. And yet capability itself had become trapped inside maintenance. Nearly every major breakthrough now served stabilization rather than expansion. Humanity was no longer building confidently toward a future. It was reinforcing the present against erosion. In massive underground coordination centers beneath mountains, deserts, and polar regions, analysts monitored the planet continuously. Earth now produced such vast amounts of unstable cross-system behavior that entire fields of science had merged into integrated synchronization disciplines. Atmospheric scientists worked beside economists. Infrastructure engineers collaborated with psychologists. Oceanographers coordinated directly with communication theorists. Because by now, everyone understood the same uncomfortable truth. The problem was not isolated anywhere. It existed in the relationships between everything. And relationships are far harder to repair than individual systems. Outside those facilities, daily life had become quieter in subtle ways. Cities still glowed at night, but nightlife diminished slightly year after year. Public spaces remained active, though movement patterns became more localized. People spent more time near familiar environments and trusted routines. The world had not become less populated. It had become less expansive emotionally. Long-distance movement increasingly felt unnecessary and less essential. Even digital communication changed tone. Messages became more practical, more immediate, less oriented around distant futures. Language adapts quickly when civilizations shift psychologically. Phrases like someday and eventually quietly lost emotional force. People still used them, but they no longer felt infinite. One cultural researcher described the era as the shortening of emotional distance. Humanity had not physically retreated from the world, but mentally it had begun living closer to the present. Meanwhile, the Earth continued its strange transformation. Atmospheric coupling inconsistencies expanded further. Some regions stabilized unexpectedly for weeks before drifting again. Ocean systems displayed localized coherence, while broader circulation models continued diverging. Weather forecasts became highly accurate within short windows, but increasingly unreliable beyond them. Reality itself seemed resistant to long-range synchronization. One of the most alarming discoveries emerged from global timing systems. Highly precise atomic synchronization networks, the systems underpinning communication, finance, navigation, and scientific coordination, were requiring increasingly frequent correction adjustments. The deviations were microscopic, but they were growing. Not enough to break civilization immediately. Enough to reveal that large-scale coherence itself was under stress. This frightened physicists in ways they struggled to explain publicly. Because synchronization is foundational to complexity. Without shared timing, even functioning systems begin drifting apart. And civilization was made almost entirely from synchronized complexity. In homes, people sensed none of the technical details directly. They sensed atmosphere instead. A quiet emotional pressure that never fully lifted. Parents became more protective of routines because routines created psychological stability. Small traditions gained unusual importance. Shared meals, familiar music, repeated habits, these became emotional anchors inside a world that no longer felt completely dependable. Humanity was unconsciously trying to preserve continuity culturally, while losing it structurally. One evening, a worldwide streaming event intended to reassure global populations experienced a brief but noticeable synchronization distortion. Audio delays affected different regions unevenly. Visual feeds corrected themselves inconsistently. The event continued successfully overall. But millions noticed the same thing simultaneously. Even reassurance now arrived fragmented. Afterwards, social networks filled not with panic, but with fatigue. People were tired of adjustment, tired of correction, tired of living inside systems that required constant adaptation simply to preserve normality. And still, civilization endured. That endurance was extraordinary. Power grids still operated across continents. Medical systems still saved lives daily. Food still reached billions. Space stations still circled silently above the atmosphere, carrying scientists who monitored a planet struggling to maintain coherence beneath them. Humanity remained astonishingly functional. But function and stability are not the same thing. Late that night, inside one orbital monitoring station, an Earth Systems specialist watched real-time synchronization maps drift slowly across multiple displays. The patterns looked almost biological now. Not random, not chaotic. More like a body struggling to coordinate signals across weakening neural pathways. The planet was still alive. Civilization was still alive. But the invisible harmony that once allowed billions of systems to operate together effortlessly was fading. And the more it faded, the more effort was required to simulate the appearance of continuity. That was the hidden truth of the final day of civilization. The world did not collapse because systems stopped working. It approached collapse because keeping them working began consuming civilization faster than civilization could sustain indefinitely. Outside the station window, Earth still looked beautiful. Clouds still curled over oceans. Cities still glowed against the dark surface. Lightning still flickered inside storms. From space, nothing about the planet visibly announced an ending. And perhaps that was the most unsettling part of all. The last day of human civilization did not look like an apocalypse. It looked like a world trying very hard to remain normal while slowly exhausting itself in the process. By the 10th phase, the end of civilization was no longer a future event. It was a condition already unfolding. Not acknowledged publicly in those exact words, not written into official declarations, but understood privately by enough people that silence itself began carrying meaning. The world still functioned. That fact remained astonishingly true until the very end. Electricity still illuminated cities through the night. Water still flowed through pipes beneath streets older than the people walking above them. Aircraft still crossed oceans beneath carefully managed skis. Digital systems still linked billions of human minds together across continents and orbital networks. Civilization remained alive in structure. But the energy required to preserve that structure had reached historic extremes. Every major system, now, depended on continuous intervention. Nothing stabilized naturally anymore. Atmospheric irregularities required active compensation by global environmental management systems. Transportation infrastructures operated through endless predictive rerouting. Agricultural production survived through adaptive climate-controlled networks. Communication grids maintained synchronization only through constant correction layers stacked atop correction layers. Humanity had become the caretaker of a civilization that no longer sustained itself automatically. And even caretakers grow tired. The emotional atmosphere across the planet changed slowly but unmistakably during this phase. People became quieter in public spaces, not fearful, simply more inward. Conversations shortened. Long-term promises were made less often. The future itself felt increasingly abstract, difficult to picture clearly beyond immediate continuity. Children adapted best. To them, instability was simply the texture of reality. But older generations carried a different burden. They remembered effortless trust. They remembered when systems disappeared into the background of life, because they worked so reliably that no one needed to think about them. Now every successful day felt earned. And anything that must be earned continuously can eventually be lost. In global coordination centers, analysts had stopped searching for permanent solutions. The language of recovery quietly vanished from internal planning years earlier. In its place came operational terms: containment, maintenance, continuity preservation, localized stabilization. These were not the words of a civilization expanding confidently into tomorrow. They were the words of a civilization, negotiating with entropy in real time. One final international summit was held through synchronized digital networks spanning Earth and orbital stations alike. Leaders, scientists, engineers, and systems theorists participated from protected facilities across the planet. Officially, the meeting focused on long-term adaptive continuity. Unofficially, everyone understood what was really being discussed: how long coordinated civilization could continue functioning before synchronization costs exceeded human capacity to sustain them. The conclusion was never spoken directly during the summit. It did not need to be. The data already said it. Global civilization remained technically operational. But globally integrated civilization, the seamless interconnected system humanity had built over centuries, was approaching exhaustion. The systems themselves were not failing fast enough to create dramatic collapse. Instead, they were drifting apart slowly enough to consume civilization through endless maintenance. It was a quieter kind of ending, and therefore in some ways more tragic, because people continued living ordinary lives inside it almost until the very last stage. In one city, a musician performed in a crowded underground station, while commuters paused briefly to listen before continuing home. In another, a father helped his daughter finish homework beside a kitchen window, glowing softly with evening rain. Elsewhere, nurses changed shifts in hospitals still humming with machinery and human effort. Couples argued over small things. Friends shared meals. Students worried about examinations whose relevance was already fading historically even as they studied for them. Humanity did not stop being human during the end. If anything, ordinary life became more emotionally precious because it continued existing against growing instability. Late that night, the first major synchronization cascade finally began. Not an explosion, not a war, a timing failure. Tiny at first, several communication timing networks drifted simultaneously beyond correction tolerance. Automated systems attempted compensation immediately, but the compensations themselves created secondary desynchronizations elsewhere. Financial systems slowed transaction validation to preserve integrity. Transportation networks shifted into conservative safety modes automatically. None of these responses were catastrophic individually, but civilization depended on billions of synchronized micro-adjustments functioning together. And for the first time, too many systems required correction simultaneously. The strain spread invisibly at first. Data centers rerouted processing loads continuously. Power grids isolated regional sectors to preserve stability. Navigation systems reduced precision tolerances. Emergency infrastructures activated contingency protocols, designed decades earlier for scenarios no one truly believed would occur. Still, cities remained lit. Still, people slept in apartments unaware that history had crossed a threshold beneath them. The world did not end in fire. It began separating. Regional systems increasingly disconnected themselves from broader synchronization networks to preserve local continuity. Nations became infrastructural islands. Cities became self-contained operational zones. Orbital habitats shifted into autonomous timing frameworks independent from Earth-based coordination systems. Human civilization fragmented not because its pieces were destroyed, but because maintaining unity became impossible. By dawn in some regions, the effects were becoming visible to ordinary people. Communication delays lengthened unpredictably. Transportation systems paused for recalibration. Digital networks operated unevenly depending on local synchronization stability. Still, no singular catastrophe arrived. Only widening separation. And perhaps that was always how a civilization built on connection would truly end. Not with destruction, but with disconnection. In the final hours of globally synchronized humanity, billions of people continued trying to preserve normal routines. Cafes opened, hospitals operated, teachers greeted students, engineers monitored systems already slipping beyond unified coordination. Human beings continued performing civilization, even while civilization itself was quietly dissolving beneath them. Then gradually, region by region, the world stopped behaving like one shared system. Not dead, not silent, just separated. From orbit, Earth still looked magnificent. Cloud systems drifted across oceans with ancient beauty. Cities still glowed through the darkness. Sunlight still touched the atmosphere in soft curves of gold and blue. Nothing visible from space revealed that the greatest structure humanity had ever created was no longer fully connected. But inside the invisible architecture of synchronization, the timing, trust, coordination, and shared continuity that held billions of lives together, something irreversible had already happened. The world had stopped agreeing with itself strongly enough to remain one civilization. And somewhere between those glowing cities, drifting satellites, exhausted coordination centers, and billions of ordinary human moments still unfolding across the surface of Earth, the age of human civilization quietly came to an end. Not all at once, but enough. After the separation, the silence did not arrive immediately. That surprised many of the people who had once imagined the end of civilization as a sudden absence of sound, a dead planet beneath cold skies where nothing moved anymore. But Earth was never silent. Not even after humanity stopped functioning as one connected species. The oceans still moved against coastlines with ancient rhythm. Wind still crossed abandoned highways and glass towers, whose windows reflected changing weather patterns no global system could fully predict anymore. Machinery still hummed inside isolated cities that continued operating independently from one another. Civilization had not vanished. It had fragmented beyond reintegration. And fragmentation changes history in quieter ways than destruction does. In the weeks following the synchronization cascades, most regions focused entirely on local continuity. Governments stopped speaking in global terms because global coordination no longer existed strongly enough to justify the language. Instead, every surviving zone became responsible for its own reality. Some cities adapted remarkably well. Urban regions with localized energy grids, contained agriculture, and stable infrastructure maintained functional societies almost immediately. Their citizens experienced the transition not as apocalypse, but as narrowing. The world became smaller overnight. Not geographically, operationally. Long-distance communication still existed in limited forms, but synchronization delays made real-time global coordination unreliable. Networks once spanning continents seamlessly now behaved like bridges crossing unstable ground. Messages arrived, but not always together. Trade continued, but not predictably. Humanity still shared one planet physically. Yet psychologically, it had already divided into separated worlds. Orbital habitats adjusted fastest. For decades they had operated with partial autonomy already, relying on tightly controlled environmental systems where synchronization precision was treated as sacred. Once Earth's global timing networks became unstable, orbital stations isolated themselves almost automatically. Above the atmosphere, life continued with cold efficiency. Below it, Earth entered a slower, stranger phase. In many cities, people continued going to work for months after the end of global civilization. Hospitals remained open. Schools taught children. Public transportation still moved through tunnels beneath streets lined with illuminated advertisements that no longer updated consistently. This created an eerie, emotional contradiction. Daily life still existed, but history had already ended beneath it. One historian living inside a northern continental city wrote in her journal, "We are still performing civilization after civilization itself has stopped existing." The sentence spread quietly through surviving networks because it captured the feeling perfectly. Human systems remained active, but the unified structure connecting them had dissolved. Over time, the effects deepened. Without synchronized global manufacturing, replacement parts became difficult to acquire. Infrastructure designed around worldwide coordination slowly lost efficiency. Advanced technologies requiring precision calibration across multiple regions became increasingly difficult to maintain. Civilization did not collapse downward in one dramatic motion. It unraveled sideways. Different places drifted at different speeds. Some regions stabilized into sustainable local societies surprisingly well. Others exhausted themselves trying to preserve levels of complexity that no longer matched available coordination capacity. The greatest loss was not technological. It was conceptual. For most of human history, people believed they were participating in one shared future. Even during wars, disasters, and political division, there remained an underlying assumption that humanity existed inside a common timeline moving broadly together. Now that assumption was gone. A child growing up in one isolated city might never speak directly with someone living across an ocean, not because communication was impossible, but because stable synchronization between distant systems became too resource-intensive to sustain continuously. Humanity remained one species, but no longer one civilization. Years passed, then decades. The atmosphere stabilized in some regions, while destabilizing further in others. Coastlines changed slowly. Migration corridors formed between survivable zones. Former nation-states faded gradually into localized governance systems built around practical continuity rather than historical identity. Memory became one of the most important resources left. Older generations described the age before fragmentation with almost mythological emotion. They spoke of instant global communication that never drifted. Worldwide transportation operating on perfect timing. Shared media experiences watched simultaneously across continents. Young people listened the way earlier civilizations once listened to stories about lost empires. Because to them, global civilization sounded almost impossible. Too large, too connected, too synchronized to feel real. And perhaps that was the final transformation. Humanity did not disappear from Earth. It simply became local again. Smaller, slower, closer to immediate reality. In orbit, old monitoring satellites still circled silently above the atmosphere, some functioning, some dark forever. Deep beneath oceans, abandoned communication cables rested across the seafloor like fossils from an age when humanity believed connection could expand infinitely without consequence. And on the surface of Earth, beneath skies still lit by sunrise and stars, people continued living ordinary lives inside separated pockets of continuity. Children were born. People fell in love. Music was still played in quiet rooms at night. The species endured. But the civilization that once connected billions of human beings into one synchronized planetary system had passed into history. Not destroyed, not conquered, simply unable to hold itself together against the growing weight of maintaining coherence. And long after the final global networks faded into silence, Earth itself continued turning patiently through space, carrying the scattered remains of humanity across the darkness, while the memory of one shared civilization slowly became legend. In the generations that followed fragmentation, people stopped calling it the end, because endings imply clarity. And there had never been a clear moment when human civilization truly ended. There had only been a long transition from unity into separation. By then, the old world survived mostly through archives. Massive digital memory vaults buried beneath mountains, sealed under deserts, or orbiting silently above the atmosphere still contained the preserved knowledge of global humanity. Languages, films, scientific discoveries, maps, histories, music, entire records of civilization remained stored inside systems built during the final years before synchronization collapsed completely. But preserving knowledge is not the same as preserving continuity. Continuity requires living connection between people across time. And that was what humanity had lost. The isolated societies of Earth adapted differently depending on where they existed. Coastal regions became smaller and more defensive as oceanic instability continued reshaping shorelines. Inland settlements focused heavily on sustainable agriculture and water reliability. Underground cities developed highly structured cultures centered around maintenance discipline, because survival depended on constant infrastructure care. Orbital habitats evolved in yet another direction. Above Earth, generations were now being born who had never walked beneath an open sky without protective systems surrounding them. To them, weather itself sounded almost fictional. Rain falling naturally, wind moving unpredictably through trees, the smell of oceans. These things existed mostly through recordings and preserved sensory archives. One teacher aboard an orbital station once played an old recording of a thunderstorm for children during a history lesson. The students listened quietly to the sound of rain striking rooftops and distant thunder rolling across open land. Several asked whether the recording had been artificially created for dramatic effect. The teacher did not know how to explain that Earth had once sounded like that everywhere. Back on the surface, some cities still retained fragments of old technological grandeur. Skyscrapers remained standing long after the systems supporting them weakened. Automated transit systems continued operating in simplified local loops. Libraries preserved books printed centuries earlier, though fewer people could fully understand the context in which those books had been written. Because context had changed completely. The idea of a single connected humanity now felt abstract. Even language drifted regionally over time. Without constant synchronization between cultures, accents deepened into dialects, dialects into separate linguistic structures. Shared meanings weakened gradually. People still understood one another across distances eventually. But not effortlessly anymore. An effort changes communication. In many regions, the greatest social value became reliability. Not innovation. Not ambition. Reliability. Communities honored people who could maintain systems consistently. Water engineers, agricultural coordinators, infrastructure caretakers, medical technicians. The heroes of the fragmented age were not conquerors or visionaries. They were stabilizers. Those who kept continuity alive one more season. One more year. One more generation. In the ruins of former megacities, nature returned unevenly. Some urban centers became overgrown slowly, plants spreading through cracked concrete while automated systems flickered unpredictably in abandoned districts. Other cities remained partially inhabited, their populations concentrated into carefully maintained sectors surrounded by silent, empty neighborhoods. Humanity had learned to shrink itself operationally. Smaller systems survived longer. This lesson reshaped philosophy too. Before fragmentation, civilization believed growth was natural. Expansion, acceleration, increasing complexity, these were considered signs of success. After fragmentation, survival depended on balance instead. Communities that attempted to recreate large-scale complexity too quickly often exhausted themselves maintaining unstable systems. Communities that adapted modestly endured. Over centuries, this transformed humanity's relationship with technology entirely. Technology was no longer viewed as a pathway beyond limitation. It became a tool for preserving equilibrium. And equilibrium became sacred. Still, memory of the old world never vanished completely. In some places, historians and archivists dedicated their lives to reconstructing the story of global civilization for future generations. They preserved satellite images of Earth glowing at night during the age of planetary synchronization. They maintained recordings of worldwide broadcasts watched simultaneously by billions of people. They archived maps of transportation systems that once connected continents almost effortlessly. Young people often stared at these records with disbelief. Not because the technology seemed impossible, because the scale of trust required seemed impossible. How could billions of strangers depend on one another so completely? How could such enormous systems remain synchronized for so long? Older archivists answered these questions carefully. They explained that civilization had survived because people once believed continuity was natural. And when that belief weakened, the systems built upon it weakened too. One evening, centuries after the fragmentation began, a child living in a quiet inland settlement asked her grandfather whether humanity would ever become one civilization again. The old man looked toward the horizon for a long time before answering. Above them, the sky was clear. Real stars were visible there now without the constant interference of dense global infrastructure lighting. The silence of the world had become deeper over generations. Finally, he answered softly, "We were never meant to stay one forever." The child frowned slightly. "Then why did we try?" The old man smiled, not sadly, but with the calm expression of someone speaking about weather or seasons. "Because for a little while," he said, "we could." And perhaps that was the final truth about the last day of human civilization. It was not failure alone. It was the ending of a temporary condition so extraordinary that humanity mistook it for permanence. A brief age when billions of people across one planet moved together closely enough to feel like a single mind. An age of synchronization so complete that people forgot how fragile synchronization really was. And even after that age faded into memory, Earth continued carrying humanity forward in smaller forms, scattered, quieter, less connected, but still alive beneath the same stars that had watched the rise and ending of civilization long ago. Part 13. Centuries after the fragmentation, the world no longer remembered itself clearly. Not because records had vanished completely. Vast archives still existed beneath the earth, inside sealed vaults protected from moisture, heat, electromagnetic decay, and time itself. Orbital repositories still circled silently above the atmosphere carrying compressed histories of human civilization in countless languages. But memory changes when no living mind remains connected to the world being remembered. The old civilization had once believed information alone could preserve continuity forever. It discovered too late that continuity also requires shared experience. And shared experience had faded generation by generation after the separation. The descendants of the fragmented age inherited Earth differently depending on where they were born. In stable inland regions, communities became deeply seasonal again. Life revolved around local climate patterns, water systems, food cultivation, and careful infrastructure maintenance. Children grew up understanding the mechanics of survival intimately because every settlement depended on participation rather than abstraction. Nothing felt distant anymore. Energy came from systems people could see. Food came from places people personally knew. Water reliability was discussed with the same seriousness earlier civilizations, reserved for economics or politics. Life became tangible again. In surviving coastal cities, adaptation took stranger forms. Rising waters and unstable weather patterns reshaped urban architecture over generations. Entire districts became elevated or partially submerged. Transportation moved vertically as much as horizontally through layered structures built atop remnants of older cities. Some coastal populations developed cultural traditions centered around movement and impermanence. Buildings were designed to shift, relocate, or detach if necessary. Ownership became less important than access. The world itself had taught humanity not to become too rigid. Far above Earth, orbital societies evolved almost independently by then. Their descendants lived inside carefully regulated ecosystems where environmental control was absolute. Every breath of air, every liter of water, every watt of energy existed inside monitored cycles. To them, the old Earth civilization seemed emotionally reckless. Why build systems so enormous that no one person could truly understand them? Why depend on billions of synchronized behaviors remaining stable simultaneously? The people of orbit viewed fragmentation not as tragedy, but as inevitability delayed. And perhaps they were partly right. Yet even there, among controlled corridors and artificial gravity systems, people still dreamed about Earth. Not the fragmented Earth below them. The remembered Earth. The one from archived recordings. Rain on rooftops. Crowded streets glowing with advertisements. Music festivals filled with thousands of strangers moving together beneath open skies. The emotional memory of planetary civilization survived longer than its infrastructure did. Because human beings preserve feeling more stubbornly than facts. On the surface, archaeologists of the later ages explored the remains of the synchronized era, the way earlier humans once explored ancient empires. They entered abandoned transit tunnels stretching beneath dead megacities. They uncovered data centers still humming faintly after centuries of autonomous operation. They discovered residential towers frozen almost perfectly in time, apartments still containing dishes, books, clothing, unfinished conversations preserved inside forgotten devices. The old world had not been destroyed violently enough to erase itself quickly. It had simply drifted beyond maintenance. And without maintenance, even the greatest civilization eventually softens into silence. One explorer described walking through an abandoned financial district where holographic advertisements still flickered intermittently above empty streets. The systems powering them no longer understood what they were advertising. The images repeated endlessly to no one. Luxury vacations, global conferences, new technology launches, promises about the future. The explorer later wrote, "It felt like listening to a civilization continue speaking after it no longer existed." That sentence became famous among later historians because it captured the strange emotional atmosphere left behind by the synchronized age. The old civilization had ended gradually enough that many of its systems continued functioning long after their purpose disappeared. Automatic trains still traveled empty routes for decades. Weather alerts broadcast to cities no longer populated. Satellites transmitted signals toward receivers that had already failed generations earlier. Humanity had created machines optimized for continuity. And continuity, once separated from meaning, became haunting. Still, the descendants of the fragmented world did not live entirely in sadness. Life adapted. New forms of culture emerged built around local identity rather than planetary coordination. Music changed regionally. Architecture reflected environmental necessity. Festivals became deeply tied to seasons, harvest cycles, and infrastructure renewal periods. People found meaning in scales they could emotionally hold again. Smaller communities often produced stronger relationships than the vast anonymous systems of the old world ever allowed. Children grew up knowing the people responsible for maintaining their water systems, food networks, and energy infrastructure personally. Trust became visible again rather than abstract. In some ways, humanity became more human after civilization fragmented. Less powerful, less unified, but perhaps less lost inside its own scale. One night, in a settlement built beside the ruins of an ancient transportation hub, an elderly archivist gathered several children beneath dim electric lights powered by a carefully maintained local grid. He showed them old footage from the synchronized age. Billions of lights visible from orbit. Thousands of airplanes crossing continents simultaneously. Crowds larger than entire surviving regions now gathering together without fear beneath enormous city skylines. The children watched in silence. Finally, one of them asked the question adults rarely asked anymore. Was it better? The archivist considered the question carefully. Outside, wind moved softly through dark ruins overtaken by generations of patient vegetation. Somewhere in the distance, an old automated signal tower still emitted a faint pulse into the night every few minutes, continuing a communication cycle that no longer reached anyone. At the time, the archivist said slowly, they believed it would last forever. The children waited for more. But the old man simply looked upward toward the stars. Because sometimes the most honest answer to history is silence. And above the quiet earth, beneath skies no longer crowded with synchronized traffic and constant global movement, the scattered descendants of humanity continued living onward through the long afterlife of civilization's final day. As centuries continued passing across the fragmented earth, the synchronized age slowly transformed from history into mythology. Not false mythology. Something stranger. Perfectly documented events that no longer felt emotionally believable. The descendants of later generations could read the records, study the preserved data, and watch surviving footage from the age of planetary civilization, yet still feel disconnected from the scale of it. The old world seemed too large for ordinary human minds to have truly inhabited. Too fast, too connected, too dependent on invisible systems no individual could fully understand. And perhaps that emotional distance was inevitable, because civilizations are not remembered only through facts. They are remembered through what later generations can still emotionally imagine themselves surviving inside. The synchronized age had become difficult to imagine. In surviving settlements, education changed accordingly. Teachers no longer presented the old civilization primarily as a political or technological story. Instead, they taught it as an environmental condition, a brief historical period when Earth systems were stable enough to support enormous complexity across the entire planet simultaneously. That distinction mattered deeply. It shifted responsibility away from simple blame. The old civilization had not failed because humans were uniquely foolish. It had failed because complexity itself requires stability beneath it. And stability, at planetary scale, had proven more fragile than humanity once believed. This understanding shaped the ethics of later societies. Large centralized systems were viewed cautiously. Communities preferred structures that could fail locally without collapsing entirely. Infrastructure was intentionally modular. Population sizes remained within manageable ranges. Most settlements avoided expanding beyond the scale where personal trust could still reinforce institutional trust directly. Humanity had learned, painfully, that coordination has emotional limits as well as technical ones. Even language reflected this shift. Words associated with endless growth gradually disappeared from common use. Instead, cultures developed rich vocabularies around balance, maintenance, rhythm, and continuity. The highest praise one could give a leader was not visionary or ambitious. It was steady. Steadiness became sacred. Meanwhile, the physical remains of the synchronized age continued changing slowly across the earth. Former megacities softened under centuries of weather and vegetation. Glass towers collapsed inward eventually after maintenance systems failed completely. Bridges corroded, tunnels flooded, highways cracked apart beneath roots and shifting ground. Nature did not reclaim the world dramatically. It reclaimed it patiently. That patience made the transformation feel almost gentle. Animals returned gradually to spaces once dominated by billions of people. Forests expanded through abandoned suburbs. Oceans swallowed sections of coastal infrastructure piece by piece. And yet traces of humanity remained everywhere. Satellite skeletons still drifted silently through orbit. Solar farms stretched across deserts long after their energy grids disconnected. Automated archives continued preserving data. No living person had enough time to fully study anymore. The old civilization had left behind an enormous memory of itself. Too enormous, perhaps. Some later philosophers argued that the synchronized age collapsed partly because humanity created more information than human emotional systems could integrate meaningfully. People became surrounded by awareness of everything while remaining connected deeply to almost nothing. Whether that interpretation was true remained debated for generations. But one thing became undeniable. After fragmentation, human attention became local again. And local attention changed consciousness itself. People noticed seasons more closely. They memorized weather patterns. They understood the names and histories of those around them personally. Life slowed enough for continuity to feel tangible again. Not easier, but more understandable. In one mountain settlement, a tradition developed where children reaching adulthood spent a night alone inside the ruins of an ancient data center buried beneath the region. The facility had once coordinated global communication traffic during the synchronized age. Most of its systems were dead now, but some still functioned faintly. Cooling systems hummed softly in darkness. Old monitors flickered occasionally, with corrupted fragments of archived information. The purpose of the ritual was not historical education alone. It was emotional perspective. The young adults sat alone, surrounded by the physical remains of a civilization that once believed connection itself could overcome every limit. Some emerged from the experience inspired. Others emerged disturbed. Nearly all emerged quieter. One account from a participant survived centuries later. "I realized," she wrote, "that they were not more advanced than us, only more connected, and perhaps those are not the same thing." The sentence spread widely because it challenged one of the oldest assumptions humanity carried through history. That scale automatically meant progress. After fragmentation, many societies no longer believed that. They viewed the synchronized age with both admiration and caution. It had achieved astonishing beauty, knowledge, medicine, communication, and cooperation. It had also become so interconnected that instability anywhere eventually threatened stability everywhere. The world became too dependent on coherence. And coherence, once broken, proved nearly impossible to restore fully. Still, humanity endured. That remained the constant truth beneath every transformation. People still woke before sunrise to begin daily work. Children still laughed during storms. Music still echoed through homes lit by carefully maintained power systems. Love still existed. Grief still existed. The species continued carrying consciousness forward across time, even after civilization, itself fragmented into smaller realities. One evening, long after the synchronized age had faded into distant memory, an old woman living beside an inland lake watched reflected starlight move softly across the water. Beside her sat her granddaughter, who had been studying preserved records from the ancient world. "Do you think they knew?" the child asked quietly. "Knew what?" "That it was ending." The old woman thought for a long moment. Far above them, invisible beyond the darkness, ancient satellites still circled Earth in slow silence, fossils of a civilization that once connected an entire species into one planetary system. "Some of them probably did," she answered softly. "And the others?" The woman looked out across the calm water. "The others were busy living." And perhaps that was the final dignity of human civilization. Not that it survived forever, but that even during its ending, people continued finding reasons to wake up the next morning beneath the same fading sky. Eventually, the synchronized age became difficult to separate from dreams. Not because the records disappeared. The records remained everywhere. Buried beneath deserts in temperature-controlled vaults, stored inside orbital memory stations still circling silently above the Earth, preserved through copied archives passed carefully between settlements generation after generation. Humanity remembered the old civilization with obsessive care. And yet memory alone could not fully restore what it had felt like to live inside a world where billions of people moved together in one continuous system. That feeling was gone, perhaps permanently. In later centuries, scholars began dividing human history into three broad eras: the age of isolation, the age of synchronization, and the age of fragments. The first age lasted most of human existence. Small civilizations emerged separately across continents, connected only weakly by slow travel and limited communication. The second age, the synchronized age, was astonishingly brief by comparison. Just a few centuries where humanity achieved near-planetary coordination through technology, energy abundance, global infrastructure, and stable environmental systems. Then came the third age, the age people now lived in. Smaller, slower, less certain, but also strangely intimate in ways the synchronized world had forgotten how to be. In many settlements, evenings became deeply important culturally. Without overwhelming digital immersion and continuous global stimulation, people gathered physically again to share stories, music, and historical memory. Oral traditions returned alongside preserved technology. Human beings rediscovered direct presence. Children listened to elders describe airports crowded with travelers from every continent, oceans crossed casually in hours, and communication so instantaneous that a person could speak to someone on the opposite side of the planet almost without delay. To younger generations, these descriptions felt emotionally impossible. Not technologically impossible, emotionally impossible. Because the trust required for such a civilization no longer seemed natural to human beings raised inside localized worlds. One historian famously wrote, "The old civilization collapsed not when systems failed, but when scale exceeded emotional comprehension." The statement remained controversial for centuries. Yet many believed it contained part of the truth. Human technology had expanded faster than human psychological adaptation. People became globally connected while remaining emotionally local creatures. And eventually, the strain between those realities became too large to maintain indefinitely. Still, later societies did not reject the synchronized age entirely. Far from it. They admired much of it deeply. The medicine, the scientific understanding, the art, the astonishing ability to cooperate across cultures and distance. Many fragmented societies preserved pieces of the old world carefully, integrating them into smaller sustainable systems rather than abandoning them completely. Tiny fusion reactors powered remote settlements. Ancient agricultural databases optimized local food production. Medical archives continued saving lives thousands of years after the end of global civilization. Humanity inherited the ruins intelligently. Not perfectly, but intelligently enough to endure. Earth itself changed slowly during these centuries too. Without the immense pressures of synchronized industrial civilization, some ecological systems partially recovered. Forests expanded across former urban zones. Animal populations stabilized in regions once dominated by infrastructure. The atmosphere settled into new long-term patterns, not identical to the ancient world, but calmer than during the final destabilization periods. The planet did not heal completely. Healing implies returning to what existed before. Earth became something new instead. A quieter world carrying the layered remains of human history across its surface. In orbit, many old stations eventually went dark one by one as maintenance became impossible. Some were intentionally deorbited into oceans. Others remained drifting silently, metallic ghosts circling the planet for centuries longer than anyone originally intended. A few orbital habitats survived continuously through all the ages, maintaining isolated cultures shaped by precision, discipline, and controlled environmental balance. Their populations remained small, stable, and cautious about expansion. They had inherited one of civilization's final lessons. Complexity without stability eventually consumes itself. Back on Earth, ruins became part of ordinary geography. Children played beneath collapsed transit structures older than their languages. Rivers flowed through the foundations of forgotten financial districts. Ancient H.